Wonderful. Thank you everyone for coming today to our second part 2 of the story of knowledge, diversifying and contextualizing knowledge, brought to us by the OER project. And so Iman is here to give us another fantastic session. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to her.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Just, a quick show of hands just to see who all was here yesterday. If you wouldn't mind just using the raise hand function to let me know if you were with us yesterday, it's helpful for me to know. Wonderful. It looks like most of you were, so welcome back. Thank you for joining again. Just to recap a little bit, yesterday we explored a case study, which was the Islamic Scholars series in the OER project's Big History course, where we discussed how students can explore stories of knowledge and different ways that they can understand the histories of where our big ideas and technologies and practices come from, and how diversifying and contextualizing this knowledge gives students a way to imagine themselves as a part of our collective learning. And so this is a really exciting field, I think, that I'm honored to be a part of. And yesterday we talked about the sort of a three-pronged approach. The first aspect being diversifying and contextualizing, which I just briefly summarized. The second being focusing on collective learning and sort of the very collaborative nature of what we do as scholars and educators and learners, and how all the knowledge that we make and share is exceptionally social and collaborative. And the last aspect, which is about evaluating narratives, is the part that I'd like to practice with you today. And by evaluating narratives, what we want students to learn to do is learn to be critical about the stories we already have about knowledge and the very limited ways that we are taught to see who gets to be a part of that story. So we left off yesterday. Pardon, let me just skip through this for just a second. We left off yesterday after discussing this case study and having read some of the articles, and we didn't get a chance to go through all of the articles, and we didn't get a chance to talk about our own classrooms. I believe we went through the first 2 articles. So we went through the Moraga School and the Jabr ibn Hayyan. So I wanted to give an opportunity to any folks who were in the other 3 groups, if you'd like to jump in and answer any of these 2 questions. No pressure if you don't want to, but if you had something that you really wanted to share, please raise your hand.
I can't get the sound to go.
Or pop it in the chat.
I can't get out of this thing. I can't see, I can't hear anything.
All right, I see Amy. Oh, maybe you had your raised hand from before. Rainey. Or Crystal, perhaps? It looks like folks might still have their hands up from before, but if you'd like to raise your hand to chime in about some of the articles you read yesterday, please go ahead. I'll also monitor the chat to see if any folks pop anything in there. But if not, we can certainly move forward.
Well, I actually did have something to add. Sorry, I just had to lower down something in the background. Sorry. So I guess in regards to question 2, we had the article that talked about the foundations of algebra and this discovery of it, and how it was actually a collective learning process, where this man took things he was learning from the essentially a university style learning environment and pulling together all these vast knowledge to form formulas that were first written in steps more so than our common day algebraic expressions. So I just thought that was really cool. It's showing how different people really do have to come together for these things to pan out. And so I think that's like an important thing for like our students to know, that it's like your learning doesn't have to happen in a bubble that's just made up of you. Like great things come from large groups of people coming together and sharing ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. The algebra, the story of Al-Khwarizmi and the algebra is a really great one to talk about collective learning, because he himself wasn't the inventor of algebra. He was a synthesizer. And most of us in our lives will not invent something completely new or original, but we'll all synthesize things, put them together with other people, and make things work by sharing in that experience of making knowledge collaboratively. And I think we're more likely to be like Al-Khwarizmi as someone who's translating and teaching and putting things together, which is still very important intellectual work that we don't always give enough credit to. And it's more likely that we'll do that kind of work. And I think it gives students a little bit more of a realistic picture of what knowledge making looks like. And I'm hoping that article also makes people, a little bit more appreciative of algebra, even though they might hate it. Bennett Sherry, the author of that article, did a really great job of bringing out that sarcasm. Rainey also points out about different cultures and their accomplishments. Absolutely, and I think it's important to see that every culture across the globe has contributed to our collective learning, and for students to see that diversity is super important. Tiffany's group had the article about the Lion of the Sea and the technology that it took to navigate. And it's really true that in that article, Bridget O'Connor, the author, does a great job of saying how the technology travels from places like China and helps these Indian Ocean sailors. But it's likely that that knowledge also went to Europeans, particularly the Portuguese, to help them sail as well. So absolutely, I think that those two articles do a really great job of showing how cross-cultural knowledge is quite a lot of the time. All right, well, what we didn't really get a chance to talk about yesterday also was bringing this back to your classroom, and that's what I'd like to focus on today with our activity. But before we dive into it and talk more about it, I'd be curious to hear what you all think about the different stories and knowledge that you already have in your classroom. Many of you mentioned things like the Enlightenment, things like democracy, and things like the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution. So these are stories of knowledge you already have. And I'm hoping that we can do some collective brainstorming here to talk about how the concept of collective learning might fit into your own curriculum to help highlight that collective and social aspect of those stories. And also maybe brainstorm and make some more collective learning as educators about how students can practice creating and critically evaluating stories. And lastly, I'd love to hear about what limitations there are to this approach. So Scott yesterday mentioned that there could be a place to talk about Mayan and Incan knowledge, and I think it's absolutely true that this is just one story among multiple stories. It happens to be an important part of our history of science, but it's not the only one. And I think it's what I'm hoping that we can do is sort of model the ways that we can invite students to do this as well, to explore their own stories and make stories like this too. So this is about Islamic scholars, but it really doesn't touch much on Africa or the Americas or Oceania or anything like that. So what I'd like to do is go into a 5-minute breakout room to discuss these questions, and we'll come back as a group and just chat about them a little bit. And I'm hoping that that'll prime us to dive into a classroom activity where we can talk more about how to get students to really engage with some of these narratives in both secondary and primary sources. So now it's about 10 after. So let's come back in at around, let's say 9:17, 9:18. So we'll take 7 or so minutes to chat, and then we'll talk through these questions together. And I will try to get these in the chat if you can't see them. All right, welcome back, everyone. It would be great if you all just use the chat feature or raise your hand to answer any one of these questions that you discussed in your group. I'm really curious to hear how this could be applied in your classroom, and also any criticisms or limitations that you know in trying to adapt this to your classrooms.
One thing my group talked about was actually when talking about like the spreading of ideas, I think like a lot of it happened through the Silk Roads. And when we talk about like the Silk Roads in our curriculum and in our classrooms, we focus a lot on like the trade aspect of it and not so much like the idea sharing aspect that happened through this time. So I guess that's one way to like pull in like even some of these articles and really personify what was happening at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we talk a lot about trade routes in social studies classes, and what's really cool to explore is the things that are a little bit harder to see. And people think ideas are invisible, but they're not, because someone had to share a document or share a technology or talk about it. And in order to talk about it, people had to meet. And so this is something that's hard for historians to trace, but where we have some information about that, I think it is really cool to actually use the metaphor of trading to see how people are trading ideas. We have a few folks in the chat as well. Rainey talks about having the students research and present about famous scientists from different cultures. Yeah, that's a great idea. And that's something that, you know, at OER, we're trying to do with our graphic biographies projects. And I think it's something that students could do a great job of. They're really great at sort of exploring and trying to find lesser known people. And what's cool is that you can have them find famous scientists, but they can also even find people locally or people who are not necessarily famous, but who are contributing to collective learning. So there might be someone in their community that they know, which is a really cool idea. Scott talked about how there's this limitation where students are expected to know certain ideas or concepts before coming in. And so teachers have a lot to do in terms of giving students background information to help students have a better understanding. Absolutely. I think it's a really big challenge because we have to teach skills and content, and, you know, students may not come in with background information that you require in order to jump into your lesson. And so oftentimes we have to make choices about what we're going to spend time on, and that means that we might cover less. And I think that's just a reality that as teachers, we all have to deal with. And so I think sometimes what we can do as a strategy there is just try to pick case studies that do a lot of work for us because we can't get to everything. But that's certainly a challenge, especially if a lot of these ideas are building on concepts that we expect students to have. Absolutely.
Oh, sorry about that. Quick question. Is the project working on like some sort of document or something that connects the state standards to any case studies, or very familiar or similar to the stories that we're covering today, like future-wise?
Yes, there are some folks on our team who are doing their best to align our courses with state standards, and you can certainly send me an email and I'll be certain to put you in touch with whoever's working on the standards for your state or your topic. So we have the big history course, and we also have world history courses, and we have, you know, documents to figure out what pieces of content fit with different state standards. So do reach out. I'll make sure my email's at the end, and I can certainly connect you to someone who's working on that.
Okay, thank you.
We have a few more comments in here. Monique talks about asking students what they're curious about in this time period, and then try to connect the dots. That's a really great idea. I love open-ended questions like that. It's really fun to get people to actually tell you what they want to think about, and that can really guide student inquiry in really cool ways. Spencer talks about discussing not only the big names of the early USA, but also contributions of everyone involved. So I really love using the shoulders of giants metaphor for political leaders, absolutely, because political ideas do travel and people build on them and shape them and change them. Aubrey talks about committees and conventions as a place to talk about collective learning. That's wonderful, because I think you can really do a deep dive into a particular committee and a particular convention, and it's not too much and too overwhelming for students. And it's a really cool sort of micro site to explore collective learning. But then, of course, as we know, these micro histories grow into big histories. So that's a cool way to scale switch there. Shoni talks about making the decision to cover less and go deeper by giving students historical context. Yeah, I think that's a decision that a lot of educators make, and for a lot of people that can pay off, because students walk away with a better understanding than, you know, rushing through things. But, you know, as Enrique pointed out, we also have to sort of balance that with standards. So I know it's an ongoing challenge. Aubrey also points out in how many people are involved in a historical document. Yes, you know, even a single document, I think it's really cool to take a single document and like walk it back historically and think how many people were involved in making this document and spreading this document and teaching this document and making it institutionalized. Dana points out making connections with older cultures and things they had or used. Yes, I think the like history of objects is a really cool way, and it's also pretty contained. And so you can take a particular object that you use or that another earlier or different culture used, and use that as a way to tell a smaller and more sort of closed in story of knowledge, but that can still be really exciting. You all have some really, really exciting ideas, and I hope that by the end of this, we can gather a bunch of ideas that we can share together. Oh, author biographies and friendships and rivalries. That's actually really fun too, and I find that students really love that kind of lesson. It kind of feels a little bit more, adding a little bit of drama to the story of knowledge can be really cool. And as you'll see, there are often rivalries in who came up with an idea first and who got credit for it. Awesome. And, you know, as I said yesterday, we can brainstorm about stories of knowledge in every field. And this was sort of my brainstorm. But we can try to do that for a lot of units where we kind of have to unpack what are the ideas that are floating around here that people are sharing, or what are the technologies? So today, as I mentioned yesterday, we will be extending this into sort of the third prong, which is evaluating narratives. And to do that, what I'd like to do is to focus on an investigation from the Big History Project course to talk through how and why individuals change their minds. And so we're picking up the theme from some of these articles about changing views of our universe, and talking about how people change their mind about how the universe was organized. So what I'd like us to focus on is critical reading and writing. And what we'll be reading are both primary and secondary texts, and we'll be analyzing some of the claims and arguments. And so I kind of want to put us all in the student chair today and try to work through this so that we can talk together at the end about what strategies we can use in our own classrooms, even if we're not teaching these particular subjects. So what is an investigation? So an investigation is a teaching strategy from our Big History course. And for those of you who are not familiar, our Big History course is a history course that essentially ties history and science together and trying to tell the story of our collective learning about our universe. And it's a history course that starts from, you know, the start of the universe and moves through major thresholds in history. And so major thresholds are things like the advent of farming. And so students can sort of get a really zoomed out view, but then we also zoom them back in through things like these Islamic scholars' biographies and other graphic biographies and features of specific people, so that they can learn how to move between scales of like this really big macro history and the finer details. But what do investigations do? So we have investigations in every unit, and investigations are similar to DBQs, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And so DBQs are document-based questions, and these are also document-based questions. They have secondary and or primary sources. But the one key difference with DBQs is that these are really open-ended prompts. So the prompt for the one we're doing today is how and why do individuals change their minds? And what I like about these really open-ended prompts is that you can adapt them to different subjects. So you may not be teaching about, you know, heliocentrism, but chances are in your course, there will be a point where folks change their minds in a really significant and important way. And you can swap out some of the sources and use this sort of teaching strategy as a way to guide students. And it really tries to connect the critical reading aspect with the critical writing. But what's really cool is that depending on what age level you're teaching, how much time you have, what your standards are, the written aspect can really be changed. So for some folks, they really want to focus on essays because they have a particular curriculum need to do that. And you can do that a few times throughout the year. We have about 9 in BHP, but you may also want to do a debate or a flip book or a speech or a gallery where you put these up on the wall and students are moving around with them. I've seen students do videos or songs, other forms as a way of figuring out different ways to communicate their conclusions. The other cool thing is that investigations can be used with Project SCORE, which is an OER project writing extension that we have. And that basically supports social studies teachers and writing instruction in social studies by giving students the opportunity to practice their writing with feedback through an automated system. So we have Project SCORE, claim analysis and prompts. So I'll make sure we have some links in the chat to the blog post about Project SCORE where you can read about it, as well as a link to the website. However, the link to the website won't work unless you sign up. So I would just leave it open and see if you can sign up later if you're interested. But for today, we're focusing on just one investigation, which is how and why do individuals change their minds? So this is an existing investigation in BHP, and it focuses on changing views of the universe. But what I want to do today is adapt it to fit this Islamic scholars curriculum. And so I kind of agonized a bit about what to add, but I actually didn't add the one that I was expecting to add, which for those of you who read the Moraga School, you know that there were some similarities between Al-Tusi's and Copernicus's drawings. And that's one piece of evidence that's discussed in that, that article. But I actually found a similar but other piece of evidence. And what we're going to do is adapt this investigation by adding 2 more texts. So this investigation has 8 texts, and when you teach something like this in class, depending on how much time you have, you may do 1 text, you may do 2 texts, you may do 8 texts. What we'll do today is break up into groups, and that's something that I often do as a strategy as well. If we have some more time, students get to break up the different strategies that they have to reading these and focus on specific texts, and then come back together as almost a conference of this and try to discuss it and piece it together. But what we have here today is this mix of secondary and primary sources. And then what I added were 2 that help us piece together the story of knowledge with the Islamic scholars. One of them is from a primary source collection we have from the OER project that I worked on. And you can access other primary source collections on the website, but this is a particular primary source collection on networks of exchange. And I'm focusing on just one of the sources, which is source 5. And this is Fibonacci's book of calculation. And essentially Fibonacci introduced really complex mathematic ideas. He was an Italian, but a lot of these ideas he got from the Islamic world from traveling. So we'll look at that source. And then the second source, which you can see there on the bottom, is a comparison of diagrams. And one of them is a European diagram, and one of them is an Islamic diagram. And the one I mentioned in the Moraga School is a similar kind of comparison between Copernicus and Al-Tusi. So if any of you are interested in that, you can also Google that and have a look at that comparison. It has this diagram. Which I'll send these slides afterwards, but it has this diagram on the right, and it even shows you how some of the letters that were used to label the variables were similar. And so these are primary sources that I'm adding here. And here's a bigger picture of the diagram, but I'll make sure you all have a link to that when we get started so that you can look at it closely. But what I'd like us to do is to go back to the investigation. So I'll send out a link to the investigation. And what I'd like to do is, oh, thank you so much, Megan. So this is the Unit 2 investigation, how and why do individuals change their mind? And what I think we can do is, let me just open it up over here. what I'd like us to do is to get into breakout rooms and to read through this. So what I've given you is the student materials on the OER site. If you sign up and you log in, you can toggle between a Spanish student version for BHP, or you'll have a third option, which will be the teacher's version. Oh, apologies. I don't think you can actually see that screen. Let me share it again. Let me know what you see in just a moment. Do you all see the investigation now?
Yep.
Oh, sorry about that. So what I was saying was here at the top left, you can toggle between a student and a teacher version if you're signed in, but because I'm showing you what you would see if you click on this link, you wouldn't have that. And there's also a Spanish version for those who are looking at BHP articles. But this is the student document, and this is an investigation that would typically do over a couple of days, because as you see, there's quite a few sources. But what we'll do is we'll just focus on a few of the sources. What I'd like to do is to split up into breakout rooms and to just look through it and discuss what's there, and have a look at them. And we'll stay in those groups as we work through these. So we'll stay in the same groups and come back together to discuss, and then go back into smaller groups. But what I'd like you all to just take a time to do is to take 5 minutes in your groups to read through the purpose and the process, and to flip through these first couple of pages, which would be what students would look at. This is the graphic organizer we'll be using. And then after that, after page 3, we have the investigation library, and that's essentially the sources that are in there. So I know it's a long document, but most of it is the sources. So we have text 1, which is a secondary source by Carl Sagan. We have text 2, which is another secondary source, which is an image and a description of it. Text 3 is also a secondary source. It's an illustration made by the Big History Project about planetary epicycles. Then we dive into some of the stuff that really links back to what we talked about yesterday. This is a secondary source about Copernicus's heliocentric view. This is a primary source. We have Galileo's letter to Kepler. And as you can see with some of the primary sources, we tried to keep them a little bit short, partly because sometimes they are short, and also because they're often a little bit harder for students to tackle. Here's another primary source in the form of an image. This is a primary source from Galileo again. And here we have a secondary source that describes the heliocentric view and how people change their mind about it. And this last page just gives you a little bit of information about these texts. Lexile measure will tell you how difficult it is. Common Core and sentence length, other information that teachers need, especially those who are working in English language learning. So I'd like you all to just go into breakout rooms for about 5 to 6 minutes to familiarize yourself with the structure of this. And then we'll come back, ask some questions, and then we'll split into groups to analyze the individual sources. So let's take 10 minutes actually, and let's sort of simulate a group activity in a classroom so that you all can get your hands in this and get a feel for it. And we can talk later about different adaptations you might make to this structure. And let me. All right, welcome back everyone. So what I was hoping that we would do is just kind of ask some questions about how this is all set up before we actually dive in and work on it in groups. And what I'm hoping we'll do in the first little work session is that we'll fill out the graphic organizer up here. To start to parse out the different aspects of these texts. But because there's so many texts, I think we'll focus on just a subset of them. And I think we'll all work on the same subset in each group, but within your groups, if you'd like to divide them out, you're welcome to. But before we start, I'm curious if anyone has any questions about the style of the investigation or the purpose of it, how everything fits together. If not, what I looked through while we were all in our breakout groups is just a subset of these that I'd like to focus on. So I'm just highlighting those here. And they may not all fit together in the most predictable way. But what I'm hoping you'll do is that you'll take the Islamic scholars articles that you had a look at and kind of keep them in the back of your mind here, because this is about how people change their minds. So if you feel like you want to consult them, especially the first two, the one we read together, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, and then the second one, the Moraga School, for anyone who happened to be in those groups, those can kind of be in the background as well, because they're about specifically astronomy, whereas the others have different topics. But for what we're doing now is we'll take just these sources in the investigation. So 3 from the original investigation and 2, which I'll share with you, links. So the first, number 9 is from the source collection I mentioned. And it's not about astronomy, but I'm hoping that you'll have a look at it and see whether it's useful for answering this question. And if not, then you can move on from it. And number 10 is a comparison of diagrams from the Islamic world and from a European context. So thank you, Megan. Megan has popped in both of those additional ones. So the Copernicus image is source 10, and source 5 is the Fibonacci book of calculations. It's source 5 in that source collection. So it's a long collection. Don't worry about the whole thing, just source 5 in there. So what we'll do is we'll break up into groups and we'll all focus on sources 4, 5, 7, 9, and 10. I will also write them in here, 4, 5, 7, 9, and 10. Feel free to glance at the other sources if you find them helpful. Also feel free, like I said, to look back at the Moraga School article that I shared yesterday. If you can share the link again, Megan, to the placemat from yesterday where we have the link. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, you can see the articles we discussed there or refresh your memory if you did join us. But yes, I'd like us to go through this and fill out that graphic organizer. And what the aim is to sort of pull out some of the different claims in there that help us answer the question, how do people change their minds? And please feel free to call me in to any of the breakout rooms if you're stuck or confused or anything is unclear. I'll be chilling here and I can hop around as needed, or feel free to send me a message. I believe you can do that from the breakout rooms, but if not, just feel free to pull me in. But we'll spend a good amount of time in the breakout rooms. Let's do a 30-minute breakout room, since I know we have quite a few sources to get through, and I want to make sure that in addition to reading them, you're having time to discuss together. And I view this as a collaborative exercise. So while you might be reading independently or while you might split things up, and I'll leave it up to you whether you all want to read all of them or you want to focus individually on different parts. There will be about 5 people in each group, so you could do that. Make sure you leave a bit of time, about 10 minutes, to really share that information so everyone's on the same page before we go to the next step. All right, so before we jump into the breakout rooms, any questions about what we're doing? How do we fill out the graphic organizer? That's a great question, Mercedes. It's not fillable. You can just take notes, whether you have a piece of paper next to you or on your computer. If you have a PDF editor, you can take notes on it. But for now, just your own notes about the graphic organizer. But thank you. Next time I will try to get you a one that's fillable. I'm sure that will make things a lot easier next time. Any other questions? All right, well, if any questions do come up, feel free to grab me. But let's put half an hour on there. So let's do 20 after. So we'll have about 26 minutes. So could you please send the link again? Certainly. All right, so let's come back at will it be 10:20 your time, or yes, 10:20, I believe. I'm in Chicago, so I'm doing some time zone conversions in my head. All right. All right, so welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a chance to look at the selected documents which we'd focused on, and kind of experimented a little bit with our organizer. So we have, as we said, this investigation, and it has a little space for additional materials. So we pulled in a couple, one being Fibonacci's Book of Calculation, which is this excerpt, and one being this diagram. I didn't include this one because it's so grainy, but this is an example of the diagram from Copernicus's and then the diagram in Nasruddin al-Tusi's, and they're a few hundred years apart. So the question we were trying to ask is, when and why should people change their minds, or how have people changed their minds? And so we had text 4, the secondary source on Copernicus's view. We had 2 primary sources, 5 and 7, from Galileo, and then additional examples. We had another couple of primary sources, although the last primary source was technically 2, but they were put together in a secondary source. And I realized that we didn't go over claim testers beforehand, so I'll just take a minute to go over them now. But in the Big History Project course, we ask students to analyze claims and think about what's underpinning them, and how we might test them. So whether something is about, whether a claim is being supported by authority, the credible source, intuition, logic, or evidence. So I put those up there, but we have a lot of cool resources on claim testers, including a poster you can print out for your classroom, which you can find in the Big History Project community, or in our community, which has Big History Project information as well. So what I'd like to do is to talk about the major claims about the universe made in each text, and see if we can tease out what supports those claims. And this is the first step in this process of just getting students to get familiar with text and get in there. And then from there, we'll talk about how we can then take them to making narratives and conclusions. And I'd be curious if any of you all have conclusions that you want to share at this point, knowing that you've only looked at a subset of these, and you know, what different ways you might want to get students to explore this kind of process of critical reading and then narratives. But let's review this. So anyone from any group, feel free to use the raise hand function, or in the chat, tell us about text 4. What are the major claims about the universe made in the text, and what are some of the ways those texts are supported? And so this is the secondary text that we're looking at, which is Copernicus's heliocentric view. So I hope you can all still see my screen. So let's get to that source here. Copernicus's heliocentric view, which was this, I think it's about a page long, a little over a page, by Cynthia Stokes Brown, and she also cites Paul Murden. Dana?
All right. So one of the things that basically it was Copernicus beginning his, she was kind of giving like a biography, a little short biography about him, and what he was using. And he felt that the Earth was the center because the math didn't match up. Ptolemy's particular views of the universe and how things were rotating, you know, weren't matching up. And so he, you know, he kept using his observations, and then he did write a short report about it. But it was something he only shared with his friends in the beginning. And it, not that it specifically says that why, but you can assume through the article itself that there was some hesitation to share this with others, because this was not the going thought process. You know, you just kind of make those assumptions from, you know, finding out that, you know, it took him 20 years to actually publish his ideas. And of course, he died that same year, which it doesn't say whether someone killed him or whether he just passed on, you know, but yeah, so it was just, you know, through his math, his evidence was, I would say, more logic, because it just didn't add up for him. And he was able to, to utilize his observation in math to conclude that the sun truly is in the center.
Yeah, absolutely. He uses a combination, as you say, like he has this mathematical sense, and some people even say that mathematical ideas, when you become such an expert, that it almost becomes your intuition too, right? But he uses logical sense to think about also the evidence, because he was making observations as well, but he was interpreting those observations through logic. And the claims he was making were that the geocentric model just didn't make sense. He was reflecting on what he was taught about Ptolemy's view of the universe. So the claim he's making is, the mathematics don't add up. There's a logical problem here. Very much the case that it was a logical analysis primarily. What about the second document, Galileo's letter to Kepler? Just look at the chat if anyone wants to type it out, but feel free to just turn on your mic if no one else is in line.
It was pretty brief, but he basically agreed with Copernicus and kind of kept quiet, just also learning from Copernicus.
Yeah, and so, here he's saying that he accepted the view of Copernicus, and on that baseline, he has started to make so many more extensions of the Copernican view, as he describes it. But like Copernicus, he also hasn't published them. So I'm wondering what you all sense in terms of, what are some of the claims he's making. So it seems like he's aligning with Copernicus, and it would be interesting to pick apart in what ways is he aligning with Copernicus, and like, what do you all think is supporting those claims? We can kind of open that up again to have a look at it as well. Oops. Well, bear with me. Sorry if I give you all vertigo as I scroll past these again. Here we are. So Galileo's letter to Kepler. I accepted the view of Copernicus many years ago. It's interesting because it's such a short little brief excerpt, but he seems to be talking about two different things. He's talking about the fact that he agrees with Copernicus, but he's also talking about whether or not he should, put himself on a line and agree. Lori?
Yeah, we were kind of talking about this because we kind of, in the beginning, it kind of was confusing for a second. We had to read the first paragraph a couple different times to make sure that we identified what he was actually questioning. But it was kind of interesting that the way that this text unfolded, because there's a little bit in the first text, it didn't really state as much of the fear about Copernicus releasing stuff. He kept things very private. I think he just wasn't ready to put it out there. He shared it with his friends, but he kind of did put it out right before he passed. But then Galileo, you see a lot more of the social fear coming through, of being ostracized and being mocked as a reason for him to not to share the information. So I think that was kind of neat that it brought the social aspect in on this one, and not just the scientific aspect. There was a lot more of the societal flow in this one.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think that really helps connect it to why and, when and how people change their minds. Because, on the one hand, he likely has a combination of logic and evidence as a scientist, just like Copernicus did. On the other hand, he's also building on Copernicus. So he's also trusting some kind of authority. But then he also has all of these feelings about, like serious worries. So as Shannon also writes in the chat, there's a lot of the power of fear is serious. He didn't share his views, partly because of that fear. And so ideas can also move or not move because of these social aspects. Nowadays we know that there are a lot of things in terms of like what you can and can't say in terms of patent law, for example. Like you can't plagiarize, you can't share proprietary information. And so information gets moved or stopped because of all sorts of reasons, like censorship, fear, worries about social fallout, or political fallout in some of these cases as well. So, we have him making a claim that's kind of modestly in the beginning, like, I agree with Copernicus, but also there's this, I'm not sure if it's time to talk about it yet. And then when we look at text 7, even though it's the same author, we now have, this is the telescope. And then we have this quite long compared to the other excerpts we looked at. Let me see if I can zoom out a little bit without it taking me all the way back up. Oh, okay, well, sorry again. So we look here, what claims did you all pull out from here about the universe, and what are the different ways that you think Galileo supports his claims here, and maybe implicitly, how is that different from the source we just looked at? Hannah?
We really enjoyed the sort of simplicity of his, like, just eyeball observation and then drawings of the sky. It's just super clear and simple and like approachable.
Yep. Which not all scientific drawings are. So I think that's really nice that, a non-astronomer can look at it and kind of make sense of what he's trying to say there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, what are some of the ways that, you think he's piecing together his claims? Do you think it's, I think, with all of these, we have kind of a combination, but if we look, clearly he has some kind of evidence, but he's doing more than just telling you what he saw. He's sort of reasoning through it as well. So, he writes here, I therefore arrived at the conclusion entirely beyond doubt that in the heavens there are 3 stars wandering around Jupiter, like Venus and Mercury around the sun. Also that there are not only 3, but 4 wandering stars. And, it almost seems like in these pictures, there's almost a mathematical way of thinking too, which I guess astronomy is always both, evidence and math. Lori, do you have your hand up? Might have been there from before, but if anyone else wants
to. I was just still hanging out there,
But yes, this one is longer, but as Hannah said, it seems simpler also because it's a piece of writing that lays out the evidence. So now we're sort of starting to see, like, okay, we have Copernicus changed his mind because of sort of a mathematical calculation. We have Galileo changing his mind because of probably a combination of all of these. Here we have another point of Galileo's thinking where we can see the logic and the evidence, and he's really not talking about authority quite as much there, right? But then we have these 2 additional examples. So one of them is here we have Fibonacci's, and as I noted, this isn't about astronomy. So I'm curious what you all thought about why is this relevant in this particular investigation of how people change their mind and how people change their mind about something like as different from this as the universe. And feel free to just take a guess, because that's what we all do when we're trying to think historically about something. Monique?
I think it proves that, he uses the same method of validating the information. He was not quite happy with the other mathematics, so he sort of took and borrowed from others to come up with something that was much easier, much simpler to do, and then he shared it with his fellow Italians.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. He's definitely doing some kind of mathematical logical reasoning here and looking around for different logical explanations that work better. I think there was another hand up, but I missed it. If anyone wants to just jump in.
Can I say that I think it validates that we all, that I think it's probably, this isn't about the stars or anything, but he's doing the same thing that the others that we've read about have done. They want to validate what they see. And if there's a problem, they want to know what that problem is and try to fix it.
So they're taking these like observations of their evidence about what they observe in the world, and they're applying logical reasoning to that to think something's like not quite right. And they're trying to validate these two different ways of sort of supporting claims. Dana, did you want to add something as well?
For me, it was a great source to solidify the idea that trade and you know, those kind of things are how we shared these ideas. This person traveled a lot, they went to different places, they learned different things, and they were able to pull that together because he was, you know, traveling so much and incorporating those into, you know, his ideas, you know, around the world.
Yeah. Thank you for sort of reading that creatively, because, you know, I put it here in this investigation and it's a little bit of an odd fit because Fibonacci's not making any claims about the universe, but maybe we can think about what claims we can pull out of it. And so as both of you have pointed out, there's questions of how people gather different ways of validating information, but also people get it from all these different places. People go looking in all these unusual places and it doesn't just appear in their brains. So he's changing his mind because he's traveling and he's encountering all these different methods. And then we have this one. And this one's tricky because, as I said, it's two primary sources and two foreign languages. So I don't expect you all to read Arabic or Greek. I think this is actually Latin, Arabic or Latin, in order to analyze this. But the actual sort of the interesting thing is this is a layered effect, is that we have a primary source, and this is actually put together in a secondary source. So this is, an article from 2007, a historical article. And in some ways, there's a claim made in each of these, which maybe we don't have access to. We can kind of look at the picture, the diagram, and make some sense of what's there. But there's also a claim being made by the secondary author by putting them together. And clearly, juxtaposition is a way of making a kind of argument or a kind of claim. So I'd love to hear what you all sort of got from this at any layer, whether you're looking at the individual ones or the connections between them. Dana, is your hand up from before, or would you like to answer this one?
It is up from before, but I could add something because I'm a talker. No, in our group, we were noting the apparent time differences between these and how very closely similar they are, the actual diagrams themselves. There was distance to them as well as time, and yet they look, pretty much identical.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other one, which I didn't include, but which is, one would kind of serve a similar kind of comparison, is with Nasruddin al-Tusi and Copernicus, who you've all read about a little bit in the biographies, but this one is just much harder to make out. But, this is also from another secondary text. So they're very similar examples. So when we look at our organizer here, what are the major claims about the universe being made in the text? This is also a tricky one because perhaps each of those is making a claim about the universe, and then the secondary source is asking you to think about them in a certain way. And we're using maybe some kind of logic, if two things look similar, and then you can fill in the blank. So we're kind of left in this kind of cloudy, foggy place, right? We've all looked at a bunch of stuff. What do we do with that, you know? And I think students need to feel this kind of interaction with texts where they're not quite sure what to do with it, but they've thought about them and they've broken them down a little bit. But then we have to push them to make narratives and conclusions on their own. And so what we're doing now is we're kind of having a narrative together. We're not, you know, you're not all going to go write an essay right now, but, you know, perhaps a spoken narrative like a debate or a speech or a conversation can help also make sense of how these texts fit together. And a lot of people will have students put them together first and then figure out the format. But I often find that actually letting students go ahead and start writing the essay or go ahead and make a comic that tries to tell a story or make a conclusion about all of these is actually a thinking process too. And writing doesn't come after, but actually for myself, for example, I find that I think through writing and I don't actually know what I think until I try to piece it together. And I think it's similar with talking. I know you've all had that feeling where you first of all, if you don't know something and you try to explain it, then you figure out your gaps. But sometimes, even if you do know something very well, explaining it helps you deepen your understanding and really solidify it for yourself. So I'd be interested in hearing, you know, are there any preliminary or provisional narratives or conclusions that you might draw, you know, after you connect sort of the Islamic scholars' biographies we looked at yesterday, and now we're looking at this handful of sources about Copernicus and Galileo, about these Islamic scholars and sort of their counterparts in Italy or in Southern Europe, like Fibonacci, like the folks who drew those diagrams. What are some thoughts you have? And feel free to just throw something out there, a belief, a question, some skepticism. Is there an argument being made already in the sources? Let's see. Shannon points out free speech is essential as it facilitates the exchange of ideas. That's really interesting, Shannon, because that's really taking off from the question of how and why people change their mind and pulling it out and saying, well, people change their minds and it has something to do with free speech. And it has something to do with how ideas get exchanged. So you could totally see a student, you know, taking these bits of information and putting it together into a debate about free speech. You know, specifically, I think the Copernicus Galileo fear being a place where freedom of speech is not working the way we think it should, but also places where we think it does work because people are borrowing, they are sharing. Clearly, these things are being published and moved around. Thank you. That's a great one. Anyone else? Shoni?
Okay, hi. I was typing this in the chat. It's so much easier to say it. I just wanted to say that one of the conclusions that I kind of came to several minutes ago, and I'm still feeling this way, is just that learning, knowledge, investigation, it's a collective process. And it goes over, it can go over time, you know, centuries. It can go over geography from one place to another. You have these similar thoughts happening and in a similar way with just looking at the drawings and the two places and the centuries apart, and even across disciplines. And hopefully students will come to that conclusion on their own. And if not, you can point it out and use everything that we've seen as evidence of that, just kind of the collective. That's what I see as a big conclusion that I'm drawing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the collective aspect is so cool. And it's not just collective in the way that we think of it with a bunch of people in one room, but as you've pointed out, across time, across space, these collective conversations can happen. And sometimes we can trace them easily. And sometimes it takes a lot of work to connect the dots, and that's what historians spend their time doing. But giving our students a taste of that, I think, is really empowering too, because they can kind of experience that realization, you know, just as you're describing, like a moment where you start putting it together, and then it's your idea, it's your own. And that feels very different, I think, than them being told it. So I can tell them in an article that, you know, Copernicus borrowed from other folks in different parts of the world. But if they can trace that conversation themselves by looking at some of these sources, and they can sit with those sources first, those conclusions have space to grow and move around. Yes, and Dana points out also, we build upon our ideas from those around us, and technology allows us to confirm or disprove ideas. And, you know, in the Big History Project, one of the things we talk about is acceleration of ideas, because, you know, as in the last century, technology has really allowed for the acceleration of so many things, and we can connect so much faster with one another. Ideas can travel across the world so much faster. So we can do a lot more in that kind of across spatial boundaries now than we used to. And as Sarah points out, free space to debate conflicting ideas, defend with evidence, and evaluate the logic. Absolutely. And, you know, you can definitely have a debate in the classroom and ask students to use these sources to explain whether or not we should have total free speech, or whether they should, they could do like a flip book about it or a comic about it. And this is a way to engage students in different modes of interacting with a text. Anyone else have a conclusion that they reached, or a way that they connected some of these, even if it's a partial conclusion? Shoni points out, with the acceleration of ideas and sharing comes more exchange about our ideas. That's very interesting, and that's an interesting claim that you can totally make across these, because for this huge chunk of history, we had the geocentric model, right? From Ptolemy all the way up to, like, look at Galileo is still worried about sharing it. So from the ancient time to the early modern time, we really didn't change our mind totally. And even the Islamic scholars did not get rid of the the geocentric model. They were maybe a step along the way, but they still thought that the sun was at the center, the earth was at the center of the universe. So look at how much has changed from the time that Copernicus is drawing on some of those mathematical ideas from Althussi, and then Galileo, and then the scientific revolution, as we call it, which, you know, there are different ways to describe that period, but we can definitely see people have changed their mind a whole lot more, you know, in a lot shorter time than before. Yeah, Rainey points out that it can help with like tolerance in the classroom. Yeah, I think, you know, these conversations about sharing ideas and what it means to share ideas, and what are the etiquettes of the ethics of sharing ideas. How should we tolerate different ideas? How should we give people respect? Those can definitely be ways to jump off from that. So we're coming to the end of our time. I wanted to leave a few minutes for some Q&As. If there's any questions you have, reflections you have, confusions, feel free to raise them. If you have any questions about how this could fit in your classroom, or how it doesn't fit in your classroom, I'd love to hear it. But I do want to remind you that we also have a lot more resources at our website. Please visit us and sign up, and stay tuned for more collaborations. And I'll leave my email here if a question comes to you later that you want to send me. But for now, I'm here for a few minutes if anyone wants to raise any questions or ask raise any concerns.
You know what, I'll go ahead and pause the recording, so that way that may have people feel a little bit more free to ask any questions. And then we'll take care of attendance just before we go. So let me go ahead and stop the recording now.
Also,